Well, here goes 10 minutes. So my topic that I wrote about was how kids are in the criminal justice system. And they shouldn't be. But many of these kids these days are doing things without thinking in their right mind, like giving into peer pressure and doing things to impress their friends. And they're doing these things because they may not necessarily know that what they're doing is illegal and might not know the full consequences of their behavior. And they also think that just because they're juveniles, they'll get away with it or get a less harsh punishment because they aren't an adult. But the youth in the criminal justice system is at an all-time high, and we as a society have to do something to fix it. There are far more kids in the system now than there were 100 years ago. Before the year 1900, at least 10 kids were executed for crimes that they committed before they even turned 14. That's a lot, and it just needs to stop. But today, the rate is much higher, and in 1999, police arrested about 2.5 million juveniles. That's a lot more than just 1900 for every 10 kids before they were 14. And there are a few factors that play into how many kids were arrested. Like back in the day, there weren't as many laws and they weren't enforced a lot. Like marijuana, it probably wasn't as enforced as a misdemeanor or seen as an arrestable crime back then because everybody did it and everybody still does it today, but it's more serious now for some reason. And today, one of the largest crimes committed by teenagers and youth is smoking and selling marijuana. Pretty much every teenager in the school system knows how to get marijuana whenever they want it. It's not that big of a deal. Just, hey, you want to sell me something? Whatever. Despite the fact of how many teenagers are spending their lives in a prison cell or a juvenile detention center, there are very few pros to the whole situation. A major pro is that these kids are getting sentenced to centers or rehabs, and they're off the streets, so they're trying to get better. But since they're off the streets, they aren't reoffending. But, for example, say a boy was locked up for raping a little girl. If he's in jail, the little girl is going to feel a lot better knowing that he can't go out and hurt her again or hurt another girl again. And that's for a long time. Another pro is with the juveniles being tried as adults. They're learning their lesson, and they soon find out that not only what they did was wrong necessarily, but they know the consequences to their actions. And when one kid sees another one getting sentenced to such a harsh punishment, it's likely to deter the other juvenile to commit that same crime because they don't want to get the same punishment. They don't want to be put in jail for something that they thought was so harmless. And by doing all of this, we can help reduce the rate of juveniles being locked up in some adult prisons or juvenile detention centers. Another huge pro to trying juveniles as adults is that it helps people to understand that a crime is a crime. You do the crime, you do the time. Whether the individual be a child or an adult, they should do the same time for committing the same crime, regardless. On the contrary, there are many cons to having juveniles in the justice system and trying children as adults. One being that it will likely ruin the juvenile's life depending on the crime. But most likely, it will leave them with a record for the rest of their life. It's going to be hard to get a good job, especially if they were arrested for like theft or put on the sex offender registry or something like that. But they're not going to be able to get a good job and be paid very well because they did that, and people don't want to trust them because they were a juvenile and did all that. Just because, like, the boss is afraid that the juvenile's record is going to affect their job and how they're doing it, and that isn't even the case. But Another con is that when you put teenagers into a place with adult criminals, the teenagers are still impressionable, and adults can persuade them to commit certain crimes after getting out because they know that the kids are going to get out before them, and they can tell them to go do all this stuff and it'll be okay, you won't get in trouble, you won't get caught, and they'll teach them better ways to do these things so that they don't get caught. There's this one guy I knew. He told me that he didn't want to be in the jail anymore because he was just learning ways to commit new crimes because he was surrounded by all these different criminals who committed all these different crimes, and it's not right, especially for teenagers to be in that kind of setting. So if a child is sent to an adult prison, he or she faces a far greater risk of being sexually assaulted, violent, and suicidal tendencies than inmates that are adults. And there's also a chance that once they get caught, they will think that next time they commit a crime, they will have found a way by then to make sure that they don't get caught and will not have to serve more time in jail or the detention center. Sending a child to an adult facility is tricky because it is high risk and they often lack the maturity to be placed there and could get very hurt by the adults that are also placed with them. Like, the adults could go in and hurt them because they're children or whatever, and I don't know. But there's honestly many reasons the children act the way they do, but I strongly believe that it starts in the home, with the parents being a big factor. Most of the stories you hear about troubled kids who don't have parents or their parents are never around. Just think about it. Most kids that are in foster care are more likely to end up in jail, pregnant, homeless, doing drugs, anything else that their peers are. But don't you think this means something? That a lot of this has to do with the parents? There are some parents that work a lot to be able to afford to give their kids what they need and what they want, and so they aren't around. But there are some who just don't care what their children do. And that's where it all starts. When mom or dad doesn't care what the child does, then who does? The child's just going to go out and do what they want because mom and dad don't care. They're not here to stop me. And also, things that are happening is that when a child is little, say for instance they're cussing or something and they're only 2 years old, that shouldn't be happening, first of all. But a major part of it is the parents not disciplining them, so they're thinking it's okay. And that's the same with all other crimes. When the parents aren't punishing their children for things, they grow up thinking that they never do anything wrong and they'll never get in trouble for anything they do, because as a child they never got in trouble either, because mom and dad didn't really care what they did. And to be honest, it's hardly the child's fault that they don't know right from wrong, because if they weren't disciplined, how would they know that there's consequences for wrong actions in their doing? And how are they going to know what's right and what's wrong? And you may think it's common sense, but to these kids it's not. And my personal opinion about juveniles being tried as adults and placed in the juvenile justice system is that it should not be happening, which you've probably already got from this video, but I feel very strong about it. I mean, obviously, if they murdered somebody or raped somebody, then yeah, they should be placed in there. But if they're 12 years old, they do not belong in an adult facility. Juvenile or juvie, then yeah, but not adult. They're too young for that. However, if it's something as simple as like theft or whatever, then they should be given probation and disciplined so harsh that they know they won't ever do it again and they've learned their lesson. But if the juvenile recommits a crime that they were not giving jail time for, then they should be placed in jail that time, or a juvenile facility, whatever the consequence should be, considering the crime. Like, I think that we should consider the first time basically a warning, but a really harsh one with probation, so that they learn the consequences of their action. It's not that hard, people. In 2010, there were 225 juveniles arrested out of 100,000 juveniles for violent crimes. That's a lot when you really think about it. Many of the violent crimes were as a result of hate crimes towards blacks and other races that were not white. In 2010, juveniles were considered to have committed roughly 8% of all homicide crimes in the United States. That's a lot too. Juveniles who are sentenced to time in an adult facility are more likely to reoffend than juveniles who are given probation or sentenced to a juvenile detention facility. Going back to what I said earlier, since they're being placed in a facility with other criminals, they're likely to reoffend because they're going to learn new ways to do things, and they're going to learn how to cover it up better next time. And it's not a good idea. But juveniles really should not be tried as adults. It'll make them more likely to reoffend. They'll get really hurt by the adult inmates, and by putting juveniles in jails, you're just increasing the percent of incarceration, and we're going to be paying more money to have these juveniles in facilities when we could have just kept them out, put them on probation, and then hopefully they learn their lesson. It's not all going to work that way, but I think sometimes it could. Also, it would make it easier for the kids to get a job when they're older and better their life because they won't have a criminal record and people will be more likely to hire them. Besides McDonald's, because McDonald's hires everybody. But you just got to remember, it's not always the child's fault that they're acting this way, and a major part of it starts with the home. So, I don't know. We got to do something, people.